My name's David Travis and this is the UX Tea Break. In this episode I look at 5 common traps for usability test moderators. This question was asked by Anna, and Anna asks, what advice do you have for someone about to moderate a usability test for the first time? Well, usability test moderation is a skill that will take more than 5 minutes to master, and I'm trying to restrict these videos to 5 minutes. So instead of going into too much detail, I thought what I would do is instead highlight some common traps that I see test moderators fall into, in the hope that you'll be able to avoid these when you run your own studies. I've even put together a graphic for you to have a look at. Here it is. I've called it traps for the test moderator, and I think there are 5 of them. The first one is around answering questions. So in a usability test, you want your participants to ask you questions because that indicates that they're struggling with something in the interface. How do I get back to the home page? How do I go to the next step of the workflow? Those are questions that the usability test participant might have, and they give you some insight into the problems that they're having. The issue is, if you answer those questions, you're never going to discover if that was a big problem that the participant had, or if it was a small, trivial problem that they could have fixed if they'd only spent 5 or 10 seconds looking around the screen. So you want participants to ask you a question, but you don't want to answer them. And it sounds a bit of an odd procedure, but the way you can deal with this is you just say to the participant, or you use something called the boomerang technique. You say to the participant, if they say, how do I get back to the home screen? You say, how do you think you get back to the home screen? If the participant says, how do I get to the next step of the workflow? You say to the participant, how would you expect to get to the next step of the workflow? And then you see if they can solve the problem themselves. Basically, you encourage them to do that. Another tip that I've heard, this comes from somebody that I know who is a driving test instructor. And on a driving test, if the person that's taking part in the test says to the driving test instructor, what should I do next? The test instructor says, just do what you would do if I wasn't here. And that's kind of a good rule of thumb to use with your participant as well. You could try saying that to them. A second common trap that I see test moderators fall into is explaining the design. So often in a usability test, participants will go about using the system differently to the way we expected. And it's very tempting when they do that to step in and tell them that they're doing it wrong and help them over the hump and explain what they should actually do next. You obviously don't want to do that in a usability test because you want to know how they actually use it, warts and all. How do they go about doing it, even if they do it the wrong way? And also related to the previous issue as well, it could well be that they might start off wrong, but then they'll quickly be able to course correct. And you want to know whether or not that's possible. Now, if somebody spends a long time and they've gone down a cul-de-sac and they're completely lost, maybe that's the time to bring them back to where they started, ask them to read the scenario again, and then embark on the task a second time. But I wouldn't help participants, particularly early on, by explaining how they go about doing the task. A third common trap that test moderators fall into is interviewing rather than thinking aloud. What I mean by that is that the method used in a usability test is the thinking aloud technique, and many user researchers would say that they know all about this and they're very comfortable with running thinking aloud sessions. But when I observe user researchers running usability tests, I'll commonly see them running which look to me like conversations or interviews or Q&As. They're not thinking aloud. With the thinking aloud technique, we want the participant thinking aloud as they work, explaining what it is they're trying to do, what they're looking for, and describing any problems that they're running into. It's a bit like a stream of consciousness that they're giving you as they work. There's not too much thought going into it. They're just describing the steps and so on, and their understanding of what they're coming across. That's where you want participants. That's the frame of mind you want them in. You don't want to be running this as an interview with the participant. A fourth problem that I'll commonly see in usability tests is the user researcher talking too much. So the test moderator is doing as much talking as the participant. Again, it's kind of related to this running it more like a an interview rather than a thinking aloud session. In a usability test, the participant should be doing the vast bulk of the talking. And if the participant that you've got isn't very communicative for one reason or another, then that's fine. Just have a relatively silent usability test. You'll still have their behaviour afterwards. You'll still see where they struggled and where they ran into difficulties, even if they're not doing a great job of thinking aloud. And also, by being silent, that can often suck out the truth. Your silence can often get people to talk more. So the emphasis for you as a test moderator here should be silent, let the participant do the talking. And then the final trap that I see test moderators fall into is soliciting opinions and preferences. This is an important one, and it's related to this issue about many people not really understanding about the thinking aloud technique. The thinking aloud technique isn't about asking people what they like or what they dislike. It's about finding out what works for people. The problem with asking people for their opinions is that most people will give you an opinion, even though it may not be very deeply held. And that's because what you're doing is you're falling foul of something called the query effect. If you ask people about particular things in your system, you're obviously going to get comments on those. So if you run a session with a number of people and you're continually asking them about the navigation, because that's something perhaps the design team are concerned about, when you look at your data afterwards, you're going to find lots of opinions, positive and negative, related to the navigation. And it's going to seem as if that's important, but it could be for the participant that the navigation isn't that much of an issue, that there are other things that are much more important than that. If you focus on asking people what they like and what they dislike, it's going to seriously mislead you, and you're also not going to get reliable data with the small samples that we use in a usability test to say one way or the other. So instead of asking for people for their opinions and preferences, focus on their behaviour. Look at what it is that they're doing. Look at the issues they run into when they're running the usability test. Well, I hope you found that answer useful, and maybe there's some other traps that you've come across that test moderators fall into. If you have, post those down in the comments. I'd like to hear them. Please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. If you have a question for a future video, please ask it below.